Imagine the government limits the amount of sugar that can be imported each year to protect domestic sugar farmers. This import quota reduces foreign competition, raises domestic prices, and changes the supply and demand dynamics in the market. But who benefits, who loses, and what happens to overall efficiency? In this video, we'll explore how import quotas work, their impact on prices and quantities, and then the trade-offs that they create.
A quota is going to be a legal limit on the amount of a good or service that can be imported. And this is another trade policy that countries and governments can use to restrict the amount of imports and try to promote U.S. industry instead. So what we're going to do here in this graph, I'm going to have say the federal government imposes a quota, and they're going to set that equal to 20 for that quantity of imported steel in our steel market example. Okay, we're going to start from an equilibrium of open and free trade with U.S. steel and imported steel into the U.S. We have an equilibrium price of 700 in both cases, and we have those same quantities that we did before for our tariff example. This is so that I'm going to set this quota equal to 20, and so that's going to give us a comparison to our tariff example to see how quotas are the same or different from taxes and tariffs for our outcomes. All right, so quota, relatively easy to start with. We're just going to say, the government says, you only get 20 units of imports of steel for those tons of steel. And that's the quota set, and that's the limit. You can't do any more imports. And so let's just draw a straight line up. Try that again. Let's draw a straight line up like that. That's our limit of quantity. You can't go any further than this quota. You get stuck up against it if you try to import anymore. Can't do it. All right, so what that's going to then give is our price for our buyers. Take that quantity up to the demand for steel, come on over, and that's going to be a price of $760, just like in our tariff example. And so that $760 will be the price buyers pay for imported steel. $760. All right, great. Foreign produced steel is a substitute for domestic produced steel. And so if the price of a substitute goes up, we're going to have a shift to the right of our demand for U.S. domestically produced steel. I want to get everything to line up properly. So I'm going to get a line here. Great. There we go. I need to get my demand curve, our new demand curve after the tariff. Will be going through right there. It's going to shift over to the right, and that's happening because price of substitute has gone up. That's the reason for why we have that increase in demand for U.S. produced steel. All right, so we see that our U.S. produced steel, we have an increase in price again, up to $760 per ton. And we'll have an increase in our quantity up to 89 tons. Right, so in general here, we're going to see an increase in price. That's one outcome from a quantity. For both domestically produced steel and foreign produced steel, we'll have an increase in quantity for U.S. produced steel and a decrease in quantity of imports. Those are exact same numbers and outcomes that we had for tariffs. Okay, so you can do a tariff, you can do a quota. It's going to have very similar impacts on these market outcomes. Okay, now back to this graph over here for the imported steel. I want to talk about what's going to happen for the buyers. This is going to be the complicated part on a quota. What's going to be the price that the buyers receive? So it could happen in a number of different ways. So it all has to do with how import licenses are allocated. How would a government impose and monitor this quota for imports? They're going to have a set of licenses, say 20 licenses. Each license is going to allow you to import 1 million tons of steel into the United States. So if you own one of these 20 licenses, then you basically are going to reap the profits of doing this, and you're allowed to do it. So if you have a boat and you bring your steel to the U.S., you don't have a license, can't unload it. You're not part of that quota. Right. You do have a license, you can unload your steel and sell it in the U.S. So it depends on how those import licenses are going to be allocated to determine how that price for the sellers, what they get to keep, is going to be determined. So option 1, if the sellers get that import license, so these are going to be the foreign sellers, the foreign producers of steel. So Nippon Steel from Japan, they get one of these licenses. So then they get to bring their steel to the U.S., and then they get to sell it at this high $760 price. Right? So if the foreign producers just get these licenses, then they get that high price of $760. Okay? But what if they don't get that high price, or if they don't get the license? Option 2, let's say some sort of intermediary gets the import license. Right. What would happen? So in an intermediary here, it's just somebody, their job is an importer, exporter. They're going to go out on the world market. They're going to buy foreign produced steel at a world market price, import it into the United States, and then they get to sell it at that $760. The intermediary does. Okay. So the sellers, so the foreign sellers, so Nippon Steel, if the intermediary gets the import license, this is going to be like a U.S. citizen or a U.S. company. Their job is just to do the importing and exporting. So what this looks like then, if they have the license, they would go to Nippon Steel in Japan, this intermediary. They would buy Nippon Steel at $660, the going world price essentially. And then the intermediaries would then turn around and sell it for $760 in the United States. All right. So the price that Nippon Steel, the foreign producer, gets is $660. The intermediary gets $760. And so it's kind of like what's going on with this area in between here. So what we have for that area, that's that difference between that $760 and the $660. Okay. So let's label this surplus that goes to the foreign seller if the seller gets that import license. Okay. If the seller gets the foreign seller gets the import license, they get to sell the product at $760, and so they get this surplus going on. This is good. So this is what happened back in the 1980s when Reagan imposed these voluntary import quotas on Japanese cars. Think Honda, Toyota, Lexus, etc. Right? The Japanese voluntarily agreed to these import quotas, reducing the quantity. But what that meant was that they actually got to sell their cars for higher prices in the United States because of it, because of these quotas. And so in that case, because of these quotas, Honda and Toyota got the import licenses, and so they benefited some from these quotas to do that. They got to keep that big surplus of higher prices. All right. The other case is that surplus is going to go to goes to the intermediary if the intermediary gets that import license. So this is going to be very desirable, right? These are going to be rents or extra surplus that is going to be divvied up because of this quota. So whoever has the property right to import steel into the United States is going to get profits, big time profits from this, okay? And so these intermediaries, they want to get these profits. The foreign sellers, they want to get these profits. So who decides who get the import licenses? Well, that's the federal government and Congress and the executive branch as well, right? Get to decide. And so there's going to be lots of lobbying going on to decide what's going to be the scheme we're going to use to get these import licenses. So you can imagine some of the cronies of a president or a congressman, they're going to give some money or some kickbacks. It's like, oh, if you give me one of these import licenses, I'm going to have all these profits. I'll take some of those profits and give you kickbacks, either it could be bribes, or they could be something like, I'm going to give this a lot of money to your election campaign, whatever it is, some other handouts or something, right? To get their hands on one of those import licenses. So these quotas can cause a lot of trouble in who gets these import licenses and can cause a lot of corruption. Great. So this is going to be the impacts of a quota. To give you like a real world example of what this might mean in your daily life, the U.S. has had a sugar quota for many, many years. And so what that means is that there's a limit amount of sugar that can be imported into the United States. And so that means U.S. sugar farmers in Florida and Hawaii are protected by this quota. They get to charge higher prices, right? What does that mean for consumers? Like we showed in the previous graph, our sugar prices are going to be much higher because of this. So some economists have done some data analysis and figured out, this is for April 2014, where I was able to find this chart. This is going to be the price for raw sugar. And so that was like 20 or 43% higher in the US, that price, than it was for the world average. So everywhere else in the world is paying 43% less than the United States for raw sugar. If you look at refined sugar, that's going to be, the United States was paying 39% higher than everywhere else in the world. And so the impact of the quotas on your pocketbook is that you're paying higher prices for sugar. Now you might say, well, I don't buy sugar, I don't cook much. Well, you buy products with sugar in it. And so if you're buying candy or lots of different things have sugar in it, the companies that make that have to buy the sugar, and it's going to raise the prices and pass them on to you. The other thing it does is affects production of where these, let's say, candy is produced, for instance. So there's a great Wall Street Journal article from 2002 that was going to be examining the shift of candy production to Mexico because of this sugar quota. And so around that time, a lot of U.S. big name candy companies were moving from U.S. factories and opening Mexican factories because of that. And so a lot of these places noted while labor costs were a consideration, like Mexican workers, you can pay them lower wages than U.S. workers, the decisive factor was a desire to escape high U.S. sugar costs that were created because of this quota. Right? An even bigger reason than labor costs for the flight of the lollipop and sour ball makers is the U.S. price of sugar. Candy manufacturers operating in Mexico and Canada pay world rates for raw sugar, about half the federally supported U.S. cost, and can easily undercut U.S. competition. I just got tired of paying welfare to Big Sugar, explains Greg McCormick, president of Bob's Candy, Inc. of Albany, Georgia, which recently opened a plant in Reynosa, Mexico. All right, so here's a real-world example of U.S. jobs leaving the U.S. and going to Mexico because of this sugar quota, kind of gumming up the works for international trade.